the woman who left an abusive relationship and built a new life. A motivational story. Chapter 1, The Breaking Point. Sarah sat in the dimly lit kitchen, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of cold tea. The bruises on her wrist told a story of pain she had endured for too long. Her husband, Daniel, had once been a loving man, but over the years, his love had turned into control, and control into abuse. Tonight, as he lay asleep in their bedroom, Sarah knew she had reached her breaking point. She had to leave, or she would never survive. Tears welled in her eyes as she thought of the life she had dreamed of as a young girl. She had imagined a happy home filled with laughter, but reality had been far from her dreams. The insults, the isolation, the fear, she had suffered enough. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision. Tomorrow, she would walk away, no matter what it took. The thought terrified her. Where would she go? How would she survive? But a quiet voice inside her whispered, "You deserve better." She clung to that thought as she packed a small bag with essentials. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew she could not let her past define her any longer. As the first light of dawn crept into the sky, Sarah took one last look at the house she had called home. Then, without a backward glance, she stepped out of the door, leaving behind the chains that had bound her for so long. Freedom awaited, and she was ready to fight for it. Chapter 2, The First Step to Freedom. Sarah walked briskly down the empty street, her heart pounding in her chest. Every sound made her flinch, afraid that Daniel had woken up and realized she was gone. But as she reached the bus stop, she took a deep breath, reminding herself that she was no longer under his control. This was her chance to start over. She had no clear plan, only a small bag with clothes, a few dollars in her pocket, and a phone with a nearly dead battery. But she had something even more important: courage. For years, she had convinced herself that she couldn't survive without Daniel, but now she knew the truth: she had been surviving despite him. The bus arrived, and she stepped inside, finding a seat near the back. As the city faded behind her, she felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. She had no idea where she was going, but one thing was certain: she was never going back. Staring out of the window, she whispered to herself, "I am free." And for the first time in years, she truly believed it. Chapter 3, A Stranger's Kindness. Hours later, Sarah found herself in a small town she had never been to before. The streets were quiet, the people unfamiliar. She had no place to stay, no job, and only a few dollars left. Doubt crept into her mind, but she refused to let it take over. As she walked past a cozy cafe, the smell of fresh coffee made her stomach growl. She hadn't eaten all day. Swallowing her pride, she stepped inside and approached the cashier. "Excuse me. I don't have much money, but could I get something small to eat?" she asked softly. The woman behind the counter, an older lady with kind eyes, studied Sarah for a moment. Instead of answering, she handed her a warm sandwich and a cup of tea. "This one's on the house," she said with a gentle smile. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, overwhelmed by the kindness of a stranger. It was a small gesture, but it gave her hope. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Chapter 4, A Job Offer. As Sarah sat in the cafe, savoring every bite of the sandwich, she overheard a conversation between two employees. "We're still looking for extra help in the kitchen," one of them said. Her heart leaped. Maybe this was her chance. Gathering her courage, she approached the manager. "I couldn't help but overhear, are you hiring?" The manager, a middle-aged woman named Linda, looked her up and down. "Do you have experience?" Sarah hesitated. She had spent years cooking and cleaning for Daniel, but that wasn't exactly a job. "I can learn quickly," she said honestly. "I just need a chance." Linda studied her for a moment before nodding. "Come in tomorrow morning. We'll see what you can do." Sarah felt a rush of relief. She had a job. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in years, she was in control of her own life. Chapter 5, A New Beginning. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the cafe early, nervous yet determined. Linda handed her an apron and showed her around the small kitchen. "You'll start by washing dishes and helping with prep. If you do well, we'll see about giving you more responsibilities." Sarah nodded, eager to prove herself. The work was tiring, but she didn't mind. Every plate she scrubbed, every order she helped prepare felt like a step toward her new life. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was building something. At the end of her shift, Linda handed her an envelope with her first day's pay. It wasn't much, but to Sarah, it felt like gold. She had earned this money with her own hands, free from fear, free from control. That night, as she lay on the small bed she had rented in a nearby motel, she felt something she hadn't in years: pride. She was no longer the woman who stayed. She was the woman who left. Chapter 6: The Fear That Lingered. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah slowly settled into her new life. She saved every penny she could, hoping to find a small apartment soon. The cafe job was hard, but she loved it. Linda even started teaching her how to make different coffee drinks, trusting her with more responsibilities. But despite the progress, fear still haunted her. Every time the door of the cafe opened, her heart raced, terrified that Daniel would walk in and drag her back. Some nights, she dreamed of him finding her, waking up in a cold sweat. She knew he wouldn't let her go easily. One evening, as she walked home, she felt someone watching her. Panic gripped her chest, and she quickened her pace. When she turned a corner, she saw a shadow move behind her. Her breath hitched. Was it him? Had he found her? She ran the rest of the way, locking the door behind her. Her hands shook as she pressed her back against the wall, trying to calm her racing heart. She had come so far, but her past was still chasing her. She had to be stronger. She had to be ready. Chapter 7: Learning to Trust Again. The next day, Sarah was quiet at work. Linda noticed and pulled her aside. "You seem troubled," she said gently. "Is everything okay?" Sarah hesitated. She hadn't told anyone about her past, afraid they would judge her. But something about Linda's kindness made her want to open up. I left someone. Someone who hurt me. I'm afraid he'll find me." Linda's expression softened. "You're safe here," she said firmly. "And if you ever need help, you have people who will stand by you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She had spent so long believing she was alone, but maybe she wasn't. Maybe there were good people in the world, people who wouldn't hurt her, people she could trust. For the first time in a long while, she let herself believe in kindness. Chapter 8: Facing the Past. Weeks later, just as Sarah was starting to feel safe, she received a chilling reminder of her past. As she was closing up the cafe one evening, she saw something taped to the front door, a note with just 3 words. "I found you." Her heart stopped. Her hands trembled as she ripped the paper down. She looked around frantically, but the street was empty. Daniel was here. Terror gripped her, but then something unexpected happened. A different voice spoke in her mind, not the voice of fear, but the voice of the woman she had become. No more running. She took a deep breath. If Daniel thought he could scare her back into submission, he was wrong. She had built a life here, and she wasn't going to let him take it away. This time, she would stand and fight. Chapter 9: Seeking Protection. Sarah's hands trembled as she held the note, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't ignore this, Daniel was close. But this time, she wasn't alone. She hurried back inside the cafe, where Linda was counting the day's earnings. Linda looked up and immediately noticed Sarah's pale face. "What's wrong?" she asked, concern in her voice. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then handed her the note. Linda's expression darkened as she read the words. "This is serious, Sarah. You need to go to the police." The thought terrified Sarah. For years, she had believed no one would help her. But Linda was right, this wasn't just about fear anymore. It was about survival. That night, she gathered her courage and walked into the police station. She told them everything about the abuse, the threats, and now, the note. The officer listened carefully and assured her they would keep an eye out for Daniel. He also advised her to change her routine and stay in well-lit areas. For the first time, Sarah felt like she had taken control. She wasn't just running, she was fighting back. Chapter 10: A Friend Support. The next day, Sarah was more cautious than ever. She constantly checked over her shoulder, afraid Daniel would appear. But she also reminded herself that she wasn't the same helpless woman she had been before. At work, Linda pulled her aside. "I don't want you walking home alone anymore," she said firmly. "You can stay at my place until things settle down." Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want to be a burden. But then she realized accepting help wasn't weakness. It was strength. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. That night, as she lay on the couch in Linda's living room, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: safety. She still had a long way to go, but she was no longer fighting this battle alone. Chapter 11: The Confrontation. A week passed without any sign of Daniel, but Sarah remained on edge. Then, one evening, as she was leaving work, she felt a presence behind her. She turned, and there he was. Daniel stood a few feet away, his eyes dark with anger. "You thought you could just leave me," he hissed. "You belong to me, Sarah." Fear shot through her, but this time, she didn't shrink back. She squared her shoulders and met his gaze. "No, I don't," she said firmly. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." Daniel took a step toward her, but before he could get any closer, a voice rang out. "She's not alone." Linda stood in the doorway, her phone in hand. "The police are already on their way." Daniel's face twisted with rage, but he knew he was caught. With a final glare, he turned and disappeared into the night. Sarah exhaled shakily, her entire body trembling. But she had done it. She had stood up to him. And this time, she wasn't the one running away. Chapter 12: The Arrest. The police found Daniel that same night. Thanks to Sarah's statement and past records, he was arrested for harassment and abuse. Sarah watched as the officers took him away, her heart pounding. For so long, she had lived in his shadow, convinced she could never escape. But now, she was free, not just physically, but emotionally. As she walked back to the cafe, Linda hugged her tightly. "It's over," she whispered. Tears filled Sarah's eyes. For the first time in years, she truly believed it. The nightmare was over. And now, she could finally start living. Chapter 13: Healing the Wounds. Even though Daniel was gone, the scars he left behind still remained. Sarah struggled with nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat, afraid she was still trapped in her past. But each morning, she reminded herself, "I am free now. He can't hurt me anymore." Linda encouraged her to see a counselor, and though Sarah hesitated at first, she eventually agreed. Talking about her past was painful, but it also helped her release the burden she had carried for so long. "Healing takes time," the counselor told her. "You've already taken the hardest step, leaving. Now, you get to rebuild." Sarah still had moments of doubt, but for the first time, she saw a future beyond her pain. A future where she wasn't just surviving, she was truly living. Chapter 14: Finding Her Own Place. With her savings growing, Sarah started looking for an apartment. She no longer wanted to live in fear or depend on others, she wanted a place of her own. After weeks of searching, she found a small, cozy studio apartment. It wasn't much, but to Sarah, it was everything. The first night she slept there, she sat on the floor, looking around at the empty space. This was hers. No one could take it away. She cried that night, not from fear but from relief. She had done it. She had built a new life for herself. Chapter 15: A New Dream. Working at the cafe had given Sarah stability, but deep down, she wanted more. She had always loved baking, but Daniel never let her explore her passion. Now, she had the freedom to dream. One day, Linda caught her experimenting with a new pastry in the kitchen. "You're really talented," she said, tasting Sarah's creation. "Have you ever thought about going to culinary school?" Sarah laughed at first, but the idea stayed with her. Why not? Why couldn't she build something for herself? That night, she looked up classes at a local culinary school. The fees were high, but she was determined to find a way. She had fought for her freedom, now, she was going to fight for her dreams. Chapter 16, Facing Her Fears. Even though Sarah was moving forward, the past still haunted her in unexpected ways. One afternoon, as she walked through the market, she saw a man who looked like Daniel. Her body froze, her breath caught in her throat, and panic set in. She knew it wasn't him, he was in jail. But the fear felt real. She rushed home, locking the door behind her, her heart racing. She sat on the floor, tears streaming down her face. Will I always be afraid? Will I ever be normal again? But then she reminded herself of how far she had come. She wasn't the same woman who once cowered in fear. She had faced Daniel and won. And she wasn't going to let his shadow control her any longer. She wiped her tears and stood up. She had survived worse, she could survive this too. Chapter 17, Small Steps, Big Changes. Determined to push past her fear, Sarah started taking small steps. She joined a support group for survivors of abuse, where she met women who had faced similar struggles. Their stories inspired her, and for the first time, she felt truly understood. She also applied for a scholarship to culinary school. She knew it was a long shot, but she had nothing to lose. A few weeks later, she received an email, she had been accepted. Tears filled her eyes as she read the words. She had done it. She was finally chasing her dreams. Linda hugged her tightly. "I knew you could do it," she said. And for the first time in her life, Sarah believed it too. Chapter 18, Stepping into a New World. The first day at culinary school felt like stepping into a dream. Sarah walked through the doors of the bustling kitchen, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread and sizzling butter. She had never been in a professional kitchen before, and for a moment, she felt like an outsider. But she reminded herself, "I belong here." Her instructor, Chef Martinez, was strict but encouraging. "In this kitchen, we don't just cook," he said, "we create. If you want to succeed, you must put your heart into every dish." Sarah took his words to heart. She stayed late after class, practicing new techniques, experimenting with flavors. Every dish she made was more than just food, it was proof of how far she had come. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. Chapter 19, The Shadows of the Past. As much as Sarah was moving forward, the past still crept up on her in unexpected ways. One evening, after a long day at school, she got a call from an unknown number. Her heart pounded as she hesitated before answering. A deep voice came through the line. "Sarah." She froze. It was Daniel. Her breath hitched as he continued, "I know where you are." She slammed the phone down, her hands shaking. He was supposed to be in jail, how had he contacted her? Panic gripped her, but then she took a deep breath. No. He doesn't control me anymore. She called the police immediately. They assured her that Daniel was still in custody, but someone might have helped him reach out. "Don't worry," the officer said. "We'll make sure you're safe." For a moment, fear tried to consume her. But then she reminded herself, she wasn't the weak woman she once was. She had faced him before, and she would face him again if she had to. But she wouldn't do it alone. Chapter 20, Finding Strength in Others. Sarah confided in Linda about the call, and her friend was furious. "He doesn't get to haunt you anymore," she said. "We'll make sure of it." Together, they installed a security system in Sarah's apartment and changed her phone number. Linda also introduced her to a lawyer who specialized in helping survivors of domestic violence. The lawyer reassured Sarah that she had rights, and if Daniel ever tried to contact her again, he would face serious consequences. For the first time, Sarah felt truly protected. She wasn't just relying on herself, she had a support system. And that changed everything. Chapter 21: The Taste of Success. Despite the fear Daniel had tried to instill in her, Sarah refused to let it hold her back. She threw herself into culinary school, determined to prove, to herself and to the world, that she was more than her past. She entered a student competition, where each participant had to create a signature dessert. Sarah worked tirelessly, perfecting her recipe, a delicate honey and almond cake inspired by her grandmother's old recipe. On the day of the competition, she presented her dish with shaky hands. The judges took their first bites, their expressions unreadable. Then, one of them smiled. "This," he said, "is extraordinary." Sarah won first place. Tears filled her eyes as she accepted the award. She had never felt this kind of pride before. It wasn't just about the cake, it was about everything she had overcome to get here. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor. Chapter 22: Letting Go. With each passing day, Sarah felt more like herself, her true self. She no longer flinched at loud noises. She no longer looked over her shoulder in fear. One evening, as she was organizing her small apartment, she found an old photo of her and Daniel. She stared at it for a long time. Then, without hesitation, she ripped it apart and threw it away. She wasn't just moving forward. She was leaving the past behind. For good. Chapter 23: A Dream Takes Shape. Graduation day arrived faster than Sarah expected. She stood in her chef's uniform, holding her diploma, feeling a sense of accomplishment she had never known before. But this was only the beginning. With Linda's encouragement, she started planning to open her own bakery. It was a daunting idea. She had no business experience, no investors. But she had passion. And she had determination. She spent weeks researching, writing a business plan, looking for small grants for women entrepreneurs. Every time she doubted herself, she reminded herself how far she had come. She had started with nothing. And now, she was building everything. Chapter 24: A Place of Her Own. Months later, Sarah stood in front of a small shop with a sign that read, "Sarah's Sweet Haven." Her bakery. Tears filled her eyes as she unlocked the door for the first time. She had dreamed of this moment, but now it was real. She could still hear Daniel's voice in her head, telling her she was worthless, that she would never amount to anything. But he was wrong. The first customer walked in, and Sarah greeted them with a bright smile. She was no longer defined by her past. She was no longer trapped by fear. She was free. Chapter 25: A Life Reclaimed. Sarah's bakery flourished. People loved her desserts, but more than that, they were drawn to her warmth, her resilience. She hired other women who had escaped abusive relationships, giving them the same chance Linda had given her. One evening, she sat outside the bakery, watching the sun set. Linda joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. "Look at what you've built," she said. "I always knew you could do it." Sarah smiled. "For the first time in my life, I feel whole." Her journey had been painful, but it had led her here, to a life she had built with her own hands, to a future full of hope. She had left the past behind. And now, she was finally, truly free. The end.